Hello, welcome to Module 5 of the DSM-4 to DSM-5 Crosswalk webinar. This course is designed to let you work at your own pace. It includes 5 modules, each lasting about 30 minutes, including a post-test. You will be asked to complete the post-test at the end of each section, and please note that if you exit a module before completion, there is no way to return to the point where you exited. So please complete each module in a single setting. All 5 of the modules need to be completed in order to receive a completion for this course. In this section, I will be discussing disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders, personality disorders, substance use and related disorders, as well as a few other diagnoses that, while not being a primary diagnosis for mental health services, may be co-occurring with individuals in the department. So we're going to start off here. The chapter was created and listed next to personality disorders, as the diagnoses contained in this chapter share many characteristics of personality disorders, particularly antisocial personality disorders, and the symptoms are more egosyntonic rather than egodystonic. This is another one of the spots where we have a dual listing of a personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder has not been moved into this chapter, but there is a dual listing due to the correlation between disorders in this chapter and current or future diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. The criterion for these disorders has not significantly changed. What has been changed is the text within each diagnosis to clarify the difference between disorders, as well as to include research on contributing factors to each diagnosis: genetic, temperamental, and environmental. These diagnoses share a high comorbidity with substance use disorders and later diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. However, early and intensive treatment has been shown to be effective in many, particularly with oppositional defiant disorder, when mood symptoms are more prominent than the argumentative, defiant, and vindictiveness behaviors. With oppositional defiant disorder, the severity is determined by the number of settings in which the symptoms are present. So an individual may be diagnosed with symptoms presenting in only one setting, such as home, but their diagnosis would be rated as mild. The more settings where the behavior is present, the higher on the severity scale they go. While kleptomania has been added here, or it has not significantly changed, but there is additional research on both risk factors and prognosis that have been added to the text. Conduct disorder fundamentally remains the same. There is greater clarity to the differential diagnosis process, and there is a separation between childhood onset and adolescent onset, with adolescent onset having the better prognosis. Perhaps the most impactful change is the addition of a new specifier for conduct disorder, which is called limited prosocial emotions, and includes 2 of the following: lack of remorse or guilt, callousness, lack of empathy, unconcerned about performance, shallow or deficient affect for at least 1 year in multiple settings. This specifier has profound implications as it is seen as a significant indicator of poor outcomes. It is important to note that the criteria for this specifier are fairly subjective, that the DSM requires that the information must be obtained from multiple formats in different settings prior to giving the specifier. So information from one reporter is not enough. The information would need to be obtained, say, from a parent and school and a social setting. There was a lot of talk about personality disorder, the changes that will be coming to personality disorder. And in Section 3 of the DSM-5, there is a review of the proposed changes that will come to this section, and we'll review that in a second. But again, this is another instance where the changes, the measurement methods, they were not agreed upon by the deadline, and so really there's no changes in the DSM-5 to the personality disorder section, other than some text revisions. However, it's pretty safe to say that the next edition will contain a dramatic overhaul to the personality disorder section. And it will look a little bit like this. There will be a primary, you will first diagnose someone with a basic personality disorder. So the personality disorder definition is there, and it needs to affect people in multiple areas of their life. So while there is greater exploration in the DSM-5 about cultural factors and the impact of environmental stressors such as racism and poverty, and it informs practitioners to make sure that while we give someone a diagnosis of a personality disorder, we need to make sure that it's not current environmental stressors that are causing the behavior that we see. So there is also an emphasis in the DSM-5, in the current version, that information must be gained from a variety of sources, especially when we're looking at someone in late teens, early 20s. It is important to, as I always like to tell my students, I want to see how they act with their mom and their friends and with me. I want to see them in multiple settings, because there are some people who we all act differently in different settings, but sometimes the shift can be quite dramatic. So when we're and also just to look at our system, if I am working in an inpatient system, I'm more likely to run across people who are agitated and demanding, but this may be due to the discomfort of the setting and instead of actual pathology. So I like to remind myself that our system is difficult to navigate, and if I encountered some of the barriers that our clients encountered, I would likely be agitated and sound entitled, such as when I go to my own doctor's office. If I were to have to wait for 2 hours, I would probably be going up front demanding to be seen. So sometimes just focusing on the context in which the behaviors are occurring and making sure that the pattern exists across multiple spectrums. Okay, so this is the basic diagnosis for any personality disorder, and this probably is not the part that's going to change. So but when we do look at the changes, you will first qualify the individual as having a personality disorder based on this same definition, but then you will have a spectrum, and it will focus on additional personality traits and the impairment in functioning across 4 domains. So you will separately rate the impairment of identity, impairment of self-direction, empathy, and intimacy, and then there will be specific traits added to each diagnosis. So this obviously sounds a little complex and will involve multiple scales of measurement, and that is why they really were not able to finish it in time. But the APA has said that they plan to have this in the next section or the next version of the DSM that comes out. So moving on to substance-related and addictive behaviors. The chapter name has been changed, as we are now also including the idea of behavioral addictions. So substance-related and addictive disorders has been broadened to include behavioral addictions. The only one that made it into this round of the DSM-5 was gambling disorder, and that's the one that has the most research and most clearly identified as as impacting the reward systems of the brain. So starting out with substance use disorder, instead of having abuse and dependence, they now simply rate, they have a substance use disorder, and you rate the severity depending upon the number of criteria. The reason that they took out abuse and dependence is that for many people doing diagnosis, they do not have the medical expertise to identify physiological dependence versus abuse criteria, and it wasn't really proving useful. So instead, they changed it to one criteria, and then the severity will be rated on the number of symptoms that they have. So they only technically need to have two. That would be a mild substance use disorder. And so they have a minimum of two criteria needed for diagnosis, and then diagnosticians will rate severity rather than abuse versus dependence. The other really significant change, and this will mean more writing for all of us, is that there is no longer a polysubstance category. So therefore, use patterns will need to be assessed for each individual substance. So your diagnosis just increased in length by 4 or 5 lines. But ultimately, it will help identify treatment needs to identify which drugs are being abused and the severity of each. And this may help if you're in a harm reduction setting to focus on the one that has the most abuse, or simply a way to help clarify all the different substances that are being used at that time, which can have significant implications for medication treatment. Okay, so when we look at the categories of substances, we have many of the same ones. Internet gaming, you'll see at the very last one, non-substance related addictive behavior. So gambling was the only one that made it in. But they are also looking at internet gaming, shopping, work, and sex addictions. But none of them had enough research or consensus to warrant inclusion. So the only one that, and in fact, they've said that the only one that may be added in the next round, the one that has the second highest amount of research, is internet gaming. There is evidence of the reward feedback, impairment and treatment. However, there is a lack of evidence that's similar enough to other behavioral addiction disorders. So one of the things they're looking at is how does the user of the behavior, how does the brain look when they are engaged in that behavior? As we'll see with gambling, a lot of the behavior, not only does it mirror that of substance use disorders, but when they do PET scans and functional MRIs, they actually see that the reward pathways are engaged almost identically to the use of cocaine, which was one of the hallmark factors in why gambling was included. So for now, if you have something like a shopping addiction, if you're working with someone who has a gaming or shopping addiction and it's causing significant impairment, it can be listed as an other specified addictive behavior disorder. So that is, if you encounter a behavior that is causing significant impairment that is addictive, you can rate it. It just will not be there. It just does not have its own category. Some of the other things just to note here is there is the other category, and that category really helps with to give a place for individuals who are taking drugs like bath salts or you know, the new stimulants and new designer drugs that are being developed. So that is what the other category is for. If there is enough information about the substance, it may be, so for example, bath salts, it may be listed under stimulants. But if you have someone that is using a new type of, or let's say they're using, now of course I've forgotten, but if they're using something that does not fall neatly into one of the other categories, you can put it in the other section. Okay, so now let's look at gambling disorder. So with gambling disorder, they must have 4 of the following, and you'll see this really does look much like substance use. The increased gambling to achieve high, restless, irritable, unsuccessful attempts to stop. Gambling when distressed. So again, this is very similar to substance use in that the person is using it as a means to cope with something, to cope with life. It's being used as a means to alleviate distress. So pathological gambling had been in the DSM-IV under impulse control disorders, but it was moved here as the neurological research came to show that it really did mirror the use of drugs as far as the pathways that were developed in the brain. It is important to also remember, though, that problem gambling may be part of a manic episode or part of a personality disorder. There are other diagnoses, so it is important to look if this behavior is an addiction or if it is part of another presentation. Okay, neurocognitive disorder. These are basically the same. Delirium and dementia are both listed under neurocognitive disorders as they all involve physiological changes in the brain. Delirium criteria remain the same, but there is text to increase the attention on the disorder and to provide a more concrete picture of how delirium may present. It is also noted that delirium is usually related to physical illness, substance abuse withdrawal, or toxic exposure. Dementia and associated disorders have been combined under the name of major and minor neurocognitive disorder. Specifiers will be used to differentiate between specific causes of the disorder. So for those that may have a, if it is specifically Alzheimer's disease, that would be listed as a specifier, but the primary diagnosis would be major or mild neurocognitive disorders. And how we separate the major and mild neurocognitive disorder is the functioning impairment. So when we look at individuals who have minor neurocognitive disorder, they're still able to live independently, and they may be in early stages of dementia, and they just need some additional supports or additional efforts in order to do what they need to do. Whereas major neurocognitive disorder is when they require a higher level of care and they're no longer able to be entirely independent. Gender dysphoria. This was, it was added to the DSM-5 to replace gender identity disorder. There was a lot of controversy around it, around the inclusion of this as a disorder. It was removed from the sexual disorders to avoid pathologizing the experience of the individual. But the way that, the reason why it was included is the way that our system works, not just mental health, but our whole health system. Our health system requires that an individual have a diagnosis in order for treatment. So the idea was for people who have gender dysphoria, whether or not they intend to have to involve a physical transition, they still might need additional services, and those services needed a diagnosis in order to be provided. So this is where gender dysphoria comes from. There's a high association of depression related to rejection and hostility, and one of the things that it is very important to consider is that the gender dysphoria diagnosis itself is based upon extremely stereotypical behaviors of gender norms. So it will talk about individual's desire to play with toys that are belonging to another gender. So it is stereotyped, but it is put in there to assist people who may need just some counseling and some support, all the way to those individuals who are seeking a physical transition into their preferred gender. And also just to note that the distress and the suicide rate definitely increased during puberty, and that particularly around the development of secondary sex characteristics. So the other diagnoses, we've talked a little bit about the V codes. The V codes, people seek mental health treatment that for many reasons that are not considered an illness. And the DSM-5 has significantly increased the number of V codes. And the V codes will change to Z codes and T codes when the ICD-10 is implemented. This will allow us to expand on what used to be Access 4, and it also helps to clarify in the diagnosis narrative what are some of the factors that are contributing to the individual's mental health presentation. And these can be found, there is a wonderful list if you go onto the APA website. We're going to be attaching some documents, but on the APA website there is a list of all the V codes and the new Z codes and T codes. So that can be really helpful because they have expanded greatly. I just want to take a moment and say thank you for sticking with me during these sections, and if you will complete your post-test for Module 5 and as well as the evaluation, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Goodbye.